Hello everybody and welcome to the Tuesday edition of Video Clips, and I'm going to start today with Informed Email of the Week. I'm trying to help you guys understand on an ongoing basis of the thinking process behind sorting out people's health issues so that you can start to think this way yourself and be more helpful to the people who you are trying to provide assistance for. I found that most of you who are watching this type of thing are passionate about health and you want to help other people, and that's where a lot of these emails come from. So I'm going to read this email to you. I'm wondering what insight you can offer. My best friend was a long distance runner, marathons, ultras, etc. She was having knee pain running, went for an MRI in November, and they found out she had a large tumor in her femur. Ordered her not to bear weight on it while they waited for biopsy results. She ended up slipping on crutches and fell on it, broke the femur. In the hospital for 3 weeks, ultimately found out it was an aggressive sarcoma, and 2 weeks ago had to have her leg amputated above the knee. I've been here helping her around the house and with her recovery. She lost a ton of weight while in pain in the hospital for 3 weeks, and she's going to have to begin chemo in a couple of weeks. Everybody is really pushing her to eat protein, telling her she needs protein to help heal her stump and get her strength up before she starts chemo. Just wondering what, if any, insight you have into nutrition for healing during chemo treatments. And I guess the first thing I would say about this before we get into what to do is to point out the fact that you can be quite athletic and still on the inside have things going on that are not that are problematic. So I don't know what this person's diet was like. She's obviously very fit, but she wasn't eating a health promoting diet. That could be, and I don't know, but that could be one of the reasons why she has cancer. Well, obviously in response to this, if you just wanted to take the easy way out, you say, well, look, people are telling her to eat a lot of protein. That's really not the right thing to do. A low-fat, plant-based diet, vegan diet even for cancer patients would be best. But the problem with doing that, the easy way out is never really easy, because what it ends up being is Dr. Pam Popper says eat more carbohydrate diet, you don't need all that protein, and then somebody at the hospital says you got to eat protein, and he said and she said and then they said, and everybody's talking, and you just can't get anywhere. And you know who ends up in the middle? This poor patient who's already got enough stress on her mind, and her helper who's very generously trying to sort this out. And these two people just get caught in the middle of the crossfire of the dueling dietetic narratives, the dueling nutritional narratives, and we see that all the time. So in order to be really helpful, the best thing, not the easiest, but the best thing, is to look into the situation a little further. First, what is the diagnosis here? Does this person have metastasized cancer? Has anybody looked at the outcomes for the chemotherapy that's being proposed? In other words, people who have this therapy live for how long after the chemo? What are the side effects? Does the person who is most affected by this, the patient, think that the side effects and the benefits, the ratio works out to the place where the chemo is worthwhile? Many times when we're talking about metastasized cancer, chemotherapy really doesn't help much. It doesn't even buy much time. I recently looked at outcomes data showing that a patient who did nothing would live for 2 years, and a patient who does the chemotherapy lives for 2.2 years. That's not necessarily, I think, what the person is looking for, who's trying to survive. For this person most likely is a young person who would be looking for decades of survival. So if the outcomes aren't so good, it may be that what's needed is to investigate alternative treatments. And by the way, as soon as you say something like this, the traditional medical crowd becomes apoplectic. This doesn't necessarily mean abandoning traditional treatment. It may be marrying traditional and alternative treatment to find a plan that has a much better potential for a better outcome for this particular patient. I've always said that when people try to eat a perfect diet, or they think that the perfect diet is the thing, and they do this while they're receiving treatment that may actually end their life early or make the last part of their life miserable, because some of these treatments are really quite harsh, that just doesn't seem to me to be a good idea. I have to be really honest with you. If I thought that there was no opportunity for me to extend my life, I don't know that I'd be worrying about making sure that my diet was low in fat. I think I might be concerned with doing some other things during this period of time. So the bottom line is that I think that the thing you do when you have a situation like this is you back up and you figure out a plan and a strategy, and you know in advance what the treatment options are, what the outcomes are, before you do something. I've often said this, that what I hear all the time from members of Wellness Farm Health is, if I'd known then what I know now, I never would have done a particular thing. And you hear this a lot about cancer, or from cancer patients, because they often don't find out that the treatments that they are getting are not particularly effective until they find out because they aren't working, or because the cancer has mutated and come back with a vengeance. So, one of my continuing mantras for cancer patients is investigate first and then start chemotherapy. Don't wait until later when things aren't working out so well. And by the way, for the person who sent this email, there's an article in the Health Briefs library that I wrote, it was either last year or the year before, that is a letter to cancer patients, to basically, these are the things you should consider, this is the way to go about it, here's some tips for talking to your family, because families get apoplectic when they think that patients aren't going to follow through and get treatment, traditional treatment right away too. Everybody goes into panic mode when cancer happens, and gosh, I really understand that. But at some point in time, the emotional tone has to come down so that the thinking can begin. Of course, what I would say to this person is you're much better off, and we've got a lot of evidence that can be shown to an individual like this, eating a low-fat plant-based diet. However, I would certainly be the first person to say this isn't going to solve all your problems, and it may not solve any problems if the treatment that you've chosen isn't really going to help you. So that's a brief overview of an informed discussion with a cancer patient faced with these issues, okay? And again, one other thing I'll point out, and I'm going to get to some content here, is the importance of looking at evidence. So you get this poor person out of the middle of he said and she said and they said and somebody else said and I read in a magazine and my neighbor's uncles, mothers, cousins, best friend, aunt says this, that, and the other. And that's when you think about it, you guys, that's what goes on all the time. Some of you who are so frustrated with this is trying to win the battle of who has the loudest voice rather than who has the best evidence. So use evidence to guide the decisions. All right, so with that in mind, I have a perfect topic to follow up. People continue to be confused about many topics, one of which is which diet is best for health improvement and weight loss. So here we are. Trying to figure this out is really complicated by the fact that poorly designed studies report such varying and unreliable results. For example, you often see studies that show that there's no advantage to eating a vegetarian or a vegan diet. And often the problem is the definition of vegetarian or vegan may exclude some but not all animal foods. In the case of vegetarian, of course, vegan excludes all animal foods. But doesn't really mean that the pattern is health promoting. Well, anytime you see a study like this, the paleo and keto folks, they live for it. They start talking about, see those vegan people, those vegetarian people, plant-based people, they're wrong, it doesn't make any difference, there's no advantage. Most people don't know how to check out the information, or they don't, and then they feel demoralized. I was working so hard to learn to cook without oil, and maybe it doesn't matter after all, and so everybody reports being confused. Well, the reason why I wanted to talk about this is just a couple of weeks ago, a study reported that eating both a vegetarian diet and a Mediterranean diet resulted in weight loss and lower cholesterol, essentially reporting that there was no difference between the two diets. Now, those of us advocating a plant-based diet advise a whole lot more restriction than is common with Mediterranean eating styles. And so what happens is, in response to this, I read my first 3 emails in the morning, I know there's something going on, because people will say, they'll start writing about things like, do I really need to eliminate oil? And you told me that I shouldn't have wine every day, but Mediterranean diets include wine, and all that sort of thing. So, well, before you start drinking wine every night and adding oil back into the diet, let's take a look at the study. And I think you'll be surprised at the difference between what the study actually shows and what people are saying about it. So for this study, researchers randomly assigned 118 overweight subjects to a vegetarian diet or a Mediterranean diet for 3 months. In addition to being overweight, the participants had one or more risk factors for cardiovascular disease. including high cholesterol, high LDL cholesterol, triglycerides, and glucose. I won't go through all the markers, it's in the article here, but they have benchmarks for what they considered high. Both groups received face-to-face, one-on-one counseling, and they were given one-week menu plans, and then people in the vegetarian group were given recipes, which is a good idea because a lot of people don't know how to cook more plant-based meals. Both diets were lower in calories, but here's something that's very important about this. They included an average of 50 to 55% of calories from carbohydrate, 25 to 30% from fat, and 15 to 20% from protein. In other words, there was really no difference between the two diets in terms of the amount of calories taken in or the macronutrient structure. So it's not surprising that the two groups had really similar results. Vegetarian dieters lost an average of 4.136 pounds versus 3.894 pounds. I converted this to kilograms for you. Lost by the Mediterranean dieters, and fat loss and changes in BMI were about the same for both groups. Now, I want you to keep in mind this is over a 3-month period of time. Neither group had changes in markers for things like oxidative stress or inflammation at the end of the 3 months. There were some slight differences in changes in cardiovascular risk factors between the groups. So the vegetarian group had 46 people who were able to lower at least one risk factor, such as total cholesterol, for example. The Mediterranean group, 35 people were able to do this. And we're talking about, again, things like cholesterol, triglycerides, and glucose. So here's the problem with the study. The diets were the same. Both groups were eating too much fat and too much protein, and fat and protein displace carbohydrate foods and starchy foods like sweet potatoes and squashes and rice and beans and that sort of thing. So they were both about the same in terms of the design of the diet, and the results were fairly dismal in both groups too. Just to put it in perspective, the vegetarian group lost an average of 3.4 ounces per week. The Mediterranean dieters lost an average of 3.2 ounces per week. Even so, the vegetarian group fared slightly better, which just goes to show you on the cardiovascular risk factors, which just goes to show you that even when people are eating bad diets, the group eating the bad diet with a few more plants fares a little bit better. Maybe we can interpret that the power of plants is actually pretty incredible. Well, what happened was that these diets were reported as having an equal effect, and of course the interpretation of the headline is that it doesn't matter that you eliminate oil and you don't drink red wine with every meal and that sort of thing. You can read the chatter online about this stuff and see what I'm talking about. Well, one of the main issues that plagues understanding about diet and health is the way in which studies like this are reported. So the medical news feeds reported that both diets worked for weight loss and health improvement. I mean, I don't know that I would conclude that they worked when we're talking about 3.2 and 3.4 ounces of weight loss per week. You know, if you have to lose 100 pounds, it's going to be the year 2030 before you hit your goal. I mean, it's just ridiculous. An accompanying editorial in the same journal gushed about how great the results were and reported that the diets were consistent with current guidelines, culturally relevant, and enjoyable. Well, the problem with using a term like cultural relevance to evaluate a diet is that diets that are culturally relevant today really are not health promoting. The author of the editorial also noted that compliance was high, but two things about that. First of all, if you don't ask people to make very big changes, compliance can be high. But if you read a lot about diets, what happens is the compliance is always high for the first few weeks, no matter what people are doing. It is the long term that becomes the problem. This study only lasted for a short period of time, and we don't really know if these people would continue to eat this way, or it's not that it was so great, but they would continue to do it for a long, long time. So studies like these follow a predictable pattern. Here's how it goes. Subjects are placed on diets thought to be more acceptable. That's the culturally relevant part. We're not going to ask you to do too much because we know it's hard to get people to do stuff. So this ensures that big changes are not required. The groups are placed on similar diets, followed for short periods of time, and success is announced when very small changes in health status or weight are achieved. Poor study design results in finding that there are no real differences between the two groups and the dietary patterns. Results are exaggerated and sometimes misinterpreted by the media. Health professionals and consumers continue the discussion about how we need more research in order to find out the best diet for health improvement and weight loss, and the endless cycle of wasted money, disease, and confusion continues. And so, a lot of people ask me why I am so focused on informed medical decision making, teaching people how to eat, how to look at research. And I've actually had people say, Pam, life would be so much easier for you. And you would have an even bigger following if you just focused on food and how fun food can be and taught cooking classes and all that stuff. And I like all that stuff too. It's just that I don't see how all that stuff makes a difference when people exist in a perpetual state of confusion and can't sort this stuff out, which is why we focus on informed medical decision making here. We think it is worth the time to teach consumers how to understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, and how to look at articles like this with skepticism. I have to say that other than people getting well, my happiest times in this office are when people say something to the effect of this. I saw an article the other day that said thus and so. It's interesting, but I'll believe it when I see it. I'll check into it. I know what you're going to say. Check it out before I jump on board, etc. And that's when we can start to see the tide turning in terms of people understanding that the headlines mean nothing. The medical journals are filled with garbage. The consumer of medical information really does have to beware and be wary. All right. Well, that's all for today. As usual, pass this on to anybody who you think might enjoy watching it, and I will be back to you Thursday with more news.